stop dreaming, you're embarrassing yourself. My brother didn't raise his voice when he said it. That's what hurt the most. He said it calmly, casually, like he was stating a fact about the weather. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment we had grown up in. The late afternoon light fell across the counter, catching dust in the air. I remember staring at those floating specks because I couldn't look at his face. I had just finished telling him about the investor meeting. I was 24, fresh out of graduate school, and for the first time in my life, someone important had listened to my idea. Not politely, not indulgently, seriously, a real investor, a real opportunity. I had spent months building my proposal. Late nights, unpaid work, endless revisions. I believed in it with a kind of quiet faith that only dreamers understand. It wasn't about money. It was about building something that mattered, something that was mine. I thought my brother would be proud. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You've always lived in your head," he said. "At some point, you have to grow up. These big ideas, they're not for people like us. People like us." That phrase landed like a verdict. He had always been the practical one, the stable one. He worked in real estate, knew how to negotiate, knew how to win. After our father passed away, he stepped into the role of man of the house without hesitation. He paid bills on time. He made decisions quickly. He carried responsibility like armor. I admired him for that, but somewhere along the way, admiration turned into permission. Permission for him to define what was possible. Permission for him to decide who I was allowed to become. "I'm not asking you to believe in it," I said quietly. "I just thought you'd support me." He shook his head. "I am supporting you. I'm saving you from humiliation. If this investor was serious, he'd be calling me, not you." That's when something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crack inside my chest. I realized he didn't see me as capable. He saw me as naive, emotional, fragile. He saw himself as the one who would fix things when I failed. The worst part, he truly believed he was helping. "I'm meeting him again next week," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "For what?" he asked. "So he can string you along. Investors don't back dreams. They back people who know how the world works." The room felt smaller. My excitement, which had been glowing all morning, began to shrink into something embarrassing. "You're a failure if you keep chasing fantasies," he added. "Stop dreaming failure." The word echoed in my head long after he left the room. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation. I tried to convince myself he was just being protective, that he was stressed, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But the truth is, words reveal what silence hides, and his words revealed something I had never wanted to see. He didn't believe in me. The next week, I went to the investor meeting alone. I didn't tell my brother. The meeting went better than I could have imagined. The investor asked thoughtful questions. He listened carefully. He asked about my vision, not my brother's credentials. He didn't need a man in the room to validate my ideas. For the first time, I felt seen. At the end of the meeting, he said, "I'd like to explore this further, but I'll need to understand the family dynamic. You mentioned your brother handles financial negotiations." I hesitated. "Yes," I said softly, "he does." I walked out of that office with hope in my hands and fear in my chest. Because I knew something my investor didn't. My brother didn't just doubt my dream, he resented it. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes. My brother started asking more questions, too many. He wanted to see the proposal. He wanted to review the numbers. He wanted to sit in on the next call. "I'm protecting you," he said again, but protection doesn't feel like control. I handed him the documents anyway, because I was still that gentle, trusting girl who believed family meant safety. A few days later, the investor's tone changed. Emails became shorter, Calls were postponed, enthusiasm cooled, then came the message, after reviewing additional information, we've decided not to move forward at this time. Additional information. I didn't ask my brother if he had contacted him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't cry in front of him. I simply watched, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Relief. That was the day I understood something painful. It wasn't that he thought I would fail. It was that he couldn't accept the possibility that I might succeed without him. That evening he looked at me across the dinner table and said, almost gently, "See, I told you." I nodded. But inside, something had changed, not my dream, my trust. The hardest part wasn't losing the investor. It was pretending I didn't know why. My brother walked around the apartment as if nothing had happened. He spoke about property listings and market trends. He complained about rising taxes. He asked me casually if I had updated my resume yet. I answered politely. I cleaned the kitchen. I folded laundry. I smiled when appropriate. Silence became my shield. For the first few days, I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe the investor had changed his mind on his own. Maybe it had nothing to do with my brother. Maybe I was being unfair. But then I found the email. I wasn't snooping. I was using the shared desktop computer to print a document. His email was still logged in. A message preview caught my eye. The investor's name. My stomach tightened. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. The message was brief and professionally written. After our conversation, I'm concerned about the internal disagreements regarding the vision and leadership of the project. I prefer to invest where alignment and stability are clear. Internal disagreements, leadership concerns, my hands went cold. I scrolled up. There it was. My brother had written, "I appreciate your interest in my sister's idea, but I believe she's underestimating the financial risk. She's very passionate, but she lacks experience. I'd advise caution." He hadn't insulted me. He hadn't yelled. He had simply positioned himself as the voice of reason, and me as the emotional child. I stared at the screen for a long time, long enough for something inside me to settle. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. He hadn't protected me. He had protected himself from the discomfort of watching me grow beyond his control. I closed the email and logged out. That evening he asked, "Did you hear back from your investor?" "Yes," I said calmly. They passed. He nodded as if he expected it, probably for the best. I studied his face. There was no guilt there. Only quiet certainty. That was the moment I realized something deeper than betrayal. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he had saved me from failure. In my heart, he had taken away my chance to succeed, and somehow that hurt more. The next morning, I began packing, not dramatically, not angrily, just slowly, a suitcase, a few boxes. My notebooks, my laptop, the framed photo of my parents. I didn't slam doors. I didn't confront him with the email. I didn't ask him why, because I already knew. Confrontation would only turn into explanation. Explanation would turn into justification. And justification would turn into me questioning myself again. I was tired of questioning myself. When he noticed the boxes, he frowned. "What are you doing?" "I found a place closer to the city." I said, "It'll be easier to focus." He leaned against the doorway. "Focus on what?" "My work." He exhaled sharply. "You're still chasing that." I met his eyes for the first time in days. "Yes," he shook his head. "You're stubborn." Maybe, or maybe I was finally learning. That night, I lay awake on a mattress in a small rented studio apartment. The walls were thin. The neighborhood was louder than I was used to. The kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The silence there felt different. It wasn't heavy. It was honest. I replayed the email in my mind, not to hurt myself, but to understand it. I saw how easily he had stepped into authority. How naturally the investor had deferred to him, how quickly doubt had replaced trust, and I asked myself a painful question. Had I been hiding behind him all along? Maybe I had allowed him to represent me because it felt safer. Maybe I had believed that his confidence could carry my uncertainty. Maybe I had never fully owned my own voice. That realization didn't weaken me, it strengthened me. Because if my dream had been quiet enough for quiet to destroy it, then I needed to learn how to speak. Over the next few weeks, I rebuilt everything, not the same proposal, a better one. I rewrote the business model. I researched independently. I attended networking events alone. I introduced myself without mentioning my brother. It was terrifying, but each time I spoke, my voice grew steadier. I didn't tell him any of this. He didn't ask. Our phone calls became shorter, polite, surface level. He would talk about market deals. I would talk about projects. The distance between us wasn't loud. It was subtle, like a thread slowly unraveling. One evening, as I reviewed my revised pitch, my phone lit up with his name. I watched it ring. For a second I considered ignoring it, then I answered. His voice was different. Not confident, not calm, tight. "Hey," he said, "I need to ask you something." I sat back in my chair. "Yes." There was a pause, then the words came, rushed and uneasy. "Why did the investor pull out of my deal? Why did the investor pull out of my deal?" His voice didn't sound like the brother I had grown up with. It wasn't steady. It wasn't certain. It carried something unfamiliar. Fear. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my small apartment, the peeling paint near the window, the stack of notebooks on the floor, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. This space had witnessed my rebuilding, my doubt, my long nights of rewriting everything from scratch. And now here he was. "I'm not sure." I said evenly. "What happened?" He stopped returning my calls. My brother replied quickly. Everything was fine. We were finalizing terms. Then suddenly, nothing. I closed my eyes for a moment. This was the same investor. After pulling out of my proposal, he had reached out to my brother directly. My brother hadn't told me at first. I had heard about it through a mutual contact weeks later, how they were discussing a large-scale property development. How my brother was leading the vision. It had stung, but not the way the first betrayal had. By then, something inside me had grown quieter. "Stronger. I don't know the details of your deal," I said carefully, "but investors look for alignment." There was a pause on the other end. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means they need to trust the person leading it." I was leading it. He snapped, then softened his tone. "I mean I was handling it." I let the silence stretch between us. Silence had become my teacher. It revealed more than arguments ever could. A month ago, I would have rushed to comfort him. I would have analyzed numbers, offered suggestions, reassured him that things would work out. Now I listened. "I don't understand," he continued. He said something about concerns, about long-term vision, about stability. The words felt familiar. I walked to the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. "Did he mention trust?" I asked gently. Another pause, longer this time. "Yes." I could almost hear him swallowing. He said he sensed hesitation, that there were past inconsistencies in communication. Inconsistencies. I remembered the email he had written about me, the cautious tone, the quiet undermining, the way he had presented himself as the rational one while framing me as emotional risk. Investors read character the way bankers read numbers. He had shown his. "I'm confused," he admitted finally. I thought he respected my approach. Maybe he did. I said, at first. My brother exhaled sharply. "What are you saying?" I hesitated. This was the moment, not for revenge, for truth, I'm saying. I began slowly, that people notice how you speak about others, especially the people closest to you. The line went silent. He asked me something before he passed on my proposal. I continued. He asked about our family dynamic, about leadership. I wasn't accusing him. I wasn't raising my voice. I was simply placing facts in the open air. And he pressed, and I told him you handled negotiations. He inhaled. I imagined the pieces beginning to move in his mind. The realization that the same dynamic he had used to weaken my credibility may have followed him into his own deal. When you reached out to him about my proposal, I said softly, you told him I lacked experience. I was protecting you, he said automatically. Maybe, I replied, but from his perspective, you showed him something else. What? That you didn't fully believe in the person you were closest to. Silence again. This one felt heavier. Investors invest in vision, in confidence, in leadership, but more than that, they invest in integrity. If a man can quietly undercut his own sister's credibility, what might he do to a business partner? I didn't need to spell it out. He understood. I didn't think, he began, then stopped. No, he hadn't thought. Not about consequences, not about how doubt travels, not about how quietly spoken words can echo in rooms you're not standing in. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said, and for the first time there was no defensiveness in his tone. Only something fragile, I know. I answered honestly, that was the truth. He hadn't acted out of cruelty. He had acted out of fear, fear that I might outgrow him, fear that he might lose control, fear that success wasn't big enough for both of us. But fear, when disguised as authority, still damages trust. I believed in my idea. I continued. I still do, and I've learned something important this past month. What? He asked quietly. That dreamers don't fund people who don't believe in them. The words weren't sharp. They weren't meant to wound. They were simply clear. He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. I didn't realize, he said slowly, that what I did would follow me. Actions always follow us, not loudly. But faithfully, I never wanted to compete with you, he added. I never wanted to compete either. I replied, I just wanted you to stand beside me. The truth hung between us like a mirror. We both saw it, and for the first time I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, peace, because I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was standing in myself. After a long silence, he said quietly, I'm sorry. And this time I believed him. His apology didn't fix everything, but it changed something, not in the past that was already written, but in the space between us. I'm sorry, he had said, and for the first time in my life, my older brother didn't sound like the authority in the room. He sounded human. After that call, we didn't speak for a few days, not out of anger, out of reflection. Some truths need quiet to settle. I didn't replay his apology over and over. I didn't analyze it for hidden meanings. I simply let it exist. In the weeks that followed, something beautiful began to grow, not between us, but inside me. I stopped waiting for validation. I stopped imagining conversations where I would finally prove myself. I stopped needing him to understand my vision in order for it to matter. That freedom felt lighter than success ever could. I kept building, not loudly, not for attention, just steadily. I found a smaller investor group, 3 women who had built their own companies from scratch. They asked thoughtful questions. They challenged my numbers. They respected my leadership. They didn't ask who handled negotiations in my family. They asked how I handled pressure. I answered honestly. I've learned that belief is a responsibility. I told them, if you don't believe in your own vision, someone else will define it for you. They smiled. 2 months later, they signed. The funding wasn't massive. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every signature on that agreement represented something deeper than money. It represented trust given directly to me. When I told my brother about it, I kept it simple. I secured funding. I said during one of our now occasional phone calls. He was quiet for a moment. That's incredible, he replied. There was no sarcasm in his voice, no subtle correction, no warning disguised as advice, just acknowledgement. Thank you. I said, and I meant it. Over time, our conversations became more balanced. He started asking questions, real ones, not to control, not to supervise, just to understand. How did you approach the pitch differently? What changed in your strategy? I answered him openly. Not because I needed him to learn, but because I no longer felt threatened by his opinion. That was the quiet transformation. The gentle girl who once shrank under his doubt had not disappeared. She had matured. She had learned that kindness without boundaries becomes permission for disrespect. She had learned that silence can be stronger than confrontation. And she had learned that walking away isn't weakness, sometimes it's wisdom. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet for coffee. It felt symbolic, neutral ground. When I arrived, he stood up to hug me. That small gesture, him standing, didn't go unnoticed. We talked about work, about life, about small things. Then he said something that stayed with me. I think I was afraid. He admitted, stirring his coffee. If you succeeded without me, I didn't know what that meant about me. I looked at him carefully. It doesn't mean anything about you. I said softly, my success isn't your failure. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth he had never considered. Family dynamics are rarely about money. They're about identity, about roles we inherit without realizing it. He had been the responsible one, the protector, the decision maker. When I stepped into my own power, it unsettled that story. But stories can change. I should have believed in you, he said. I smiled gently. You should have believed in yourself enough not to compete. He let out a quiet laugh. Fair, there was no bitterness in that moment, only growth. As I walked home afterward, I felt something settle fully inside me. Not pride, not vindication, peace. I realized I no longer needed him to see me as capable. I already knew I was. And strangely, once I stopped needing it, he began offering it freely. Natural consequences had done what confrontation never could. His investor pulled out, and not because I exposed him, not because I humiliated him, but because integrity reveals itself over time. My opportunity returned not because I fought him, but because I chose to stand on my own. That's the quiet justice life offers when we choose dignity over drama. Dreams don't require everyone's belief. They require yours, and sometimes the most powerful response to "you're a failure" isn't an argument. It's growth. My brother once told me to stop dreaming. Today, he asks me what I'm building next, and I answer with calm certainty. Because I finally understand something simple and unshakable. Respect begins where self-doubt ends.